Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something very relaxing. We're going to wander slowly through medieval castles. Not the shiny fairy tale ones from movies, the real ones. Cold, drafty, smelling faintly of damp straw, old smoke, and human disappointment. So dim the lights, get comfortable, let your phone fall gently onto your chest, and let's talk, very calmly, about the children who were born inside medieval castles, but weren't nobles. Because history loves kings and queens. History adores princes with ridiculous hats and princesses named something like Matilda or Eleanor. But castles were full of other people, an uncomfortable number of other people, and they had children, many children, and those kids lived their entire lives in the shadow of stone walls they would never own. So let's begin there, inside the castle, behind the tapestries, below the great hall, near the kitchens, and sometimes, unfortunately, in the stables. Now, when people picture a medieval castle, they usually imagine banquets, golden goblets, roasted meats, a noble child learning Latin while a monk nods approvingly. But the average castle was more like a small town, a cramped, noisy, permanently underheated town, full of servants, guards, craftsmen, laundrywomen, priests, falconers, grooms, messengers, cooks, and people whose job titles we've completely lost because no one thought to write them down. All of those people lived inside or just around the castle, and many of them raised families there. So children were everywhere, running through corridors, sleeping near hearths, getting yelled at for being underfoot while someone tried to carry a barrel of ale upstairs. These children were not nobles. They were not educated for leadership. They were not dressed in silk. They were not being groomed for thrones. They were being groomed for work, from the moment they could stand without wobbling too much. Most non-noble children born in castles were the children of servants, kitchen staff, stable hands, blacksmiths, guards, or lower-ranking administrative workers who handled boring but necessary tasks like counting grain or managing laundry. And their lives followed a very predictable arc: short childhood, long labor, and very little chance of escape. Let's start with infancy, which, historically speaking, was a bit of a gamble. Castles were not clean places. They were damp, crowded, and full of diseases that historians like to politely call common illnesses, and we would call nightmare bacteria. Infant mortality was high, painfully high. No lullabies here, just quiet acceptance that not every baby would make it through the winter. If a child survived infancy, congratulations. You had cleared the first level of medieval existence. Now came childhood, which was not a separate life stage the way we think of it today. There was no concept of just being a kid. There was only small human who will soon be useful. By around the age of 5 or 6, children began helping. Not helping in the set-the-table sense, helping in the carry water, scrub floors, feed animals, watch younger siblings sense. Castle children knew the rhythms of the place better than anyone. They knew when bread was baked. They knew when guards changed shifts. They knew which hallways were warmer in winter. They knew where not to stand when the lord of the castle was in a mood. And moods mattered, because castles were hierarchical in a way that was impossible to escape. These children grew up seeing nobility constantly. They watched noble children being taught to read while they themselves were illiterate. They watched feasts they would never attend. They watched punishments they would absolutely receive. And slowly, quietly, they learned their place. Some children were apprenticed early. If your parent had a skilled trade,
Blacksmithing, carpentry, baking, you might be apprenticed by age 7 or 8, which meant long hours, sore hands, and constant correction. Mistakes were not learning opportunities, they were personal failings, sometimes loudly addressed. Other children were absorbed directly into castle labor. Girls often went into kitchens, laundry rooms, or childcare roles. Boys were sent to stables, workshops, or guard-related tasks if they showed any physical strength. And yes, some children worked in places historians try not to dwell on, like cleaning latrines. Someone had to do it. It was often the smallest, least powerful people available. Now, occasionally, a non-noble child might catch the attention of someone important. A priest notices intelligence, a noblewoman notices obedience, a knight notices strength. This could go well, or it could go nowhere, or it could go very badly. A small number of non-noble children were educated alongside noble children as companions. This sounds nice. It was not equal. They were reminders of hierarchy. Someone to play with, someone to compare against, someone who could be dismissed at any moment. And when noble children grew older and moved on, to courts, marriages, religious institutions, the non-noble child stayed behind, still serving, still invisible. Now let's talk about illegitimate children, because castles produced those too, constantly. Nobles had affairs, servants had affairs. People lived very close together. Privacy was theoretical. If a servant woman gave birth to a child fathered by another servant, life went on, hard but familiar. If the father was noble, things became complicated. Some illegitimate noble children were acknowledged, given small allowances, trained for clerical roles, sometimes even granted land later in life. Most were not. Many illegitimate noble children born in castles were quietly absorbed into servant life. They grew up watching a man who might be their father walk past them without acknowledgement. They were reminders of indiscretion, embarrassments wrapped in swaddling cloth. Occasionally, a child would be sent away, to a monastery, to another household, anywhere out of sight. And if the mother pushed too hard for recognition, well, medieval power structures were not kind to women who caused inconvenience. Now let's float gently over to education, or rather the lack of it. Most non-noble children in castles did not learn to read. They didn't need to. Their futures did not require literacy. They required endurance. Some learned numbers, enough to count supplies, enough to follow instructions, enough to avoid being accused of theft. But stories, books, those were for other people. Their learning was physical, how to carry weight without injury, how to move quietly, how to obey quickly, how to endure cold without complaining. Now, childhood friendships existed. Children played, they laughed, they told stories, they stole moments of joy where they could. But play was always temporary, work always returned. By adolescence, castle children were essentially adults. Teenage girls were married off if possible. Teenage boys were working full-time. The idea of adolescence as a protected phase simply didn't exist. And many never left the castle. They were born there, they worked there, they died there. Some did leave. They married into nearby villages. They followed nobles to other estates. They joined religious orders if they were lucky. But upward mobility was rare. Castles were machines designed to preserve hierarchy, not disrupt it. And psychologically, this did something interesting. These children grew up surrounded by power they would never have, luxury they would never touch, decisions they would never influence. They learned caution, they learned silence, they learned when to disappear. They also learned gossip. Castles ran on gossip. Servant children heard everything. Affairs, plots, temper tantrums. the exact moment a noble marriage began to rot. But knowing things did not mean being able to act on them. It just meant knowing. And then there were times of crisis, sieges, famines, plagues. During sieges, non-noble children suffered the most. Food was rationed, priority went to soldiers and nobility. Children grew weaker, quieter. During plagues, they died in higher numbers. No isolation, no care, just more bodies in a place already short on space. And when castles fell, well, history tends to focus on nobles being captured or ransomed. Servant children rarely appear in those accounts, which tells you everything you need to know. By adulthood, if they survived, these children became part of the castle's permanent
All right, let's ease back in. If you're still here, good. If you're half asleep, even better. That's kind of the goal. Last time, we left our castle children still small, still running errands, still learning, very quietly, that life inside stone walls was not designed for them. So now let's let time drift forward, slowly, like a candle burning down while nobody really notices. Because medieval castles were excellent at one thing above all else: turning children into adults before anyone bothered to tell them. By the age of 10 or 11, a non-noble child inside a castle was no longer considered a child. Not really. They were a worker who happened to be short. Their bodies were already used to labor. Cold floors, long hours, hunger that never quite went away. And emotionally, they had already learned restraint. You did not cry loudly. You did not complain. You did not ask questions unless spoken to. Castle life rewarded obedience and punished attention. Now, boys and girls began to diverge more clearly at this stage. Not gently, not gradually, just abruptly. Boys were pushed toward physical roles, stables, workshops, guard-related duties like carrying equipment or running messages. Some boys dreamed of becoming soldiers, which makes sense. It was the only visible form of power available to them. But very few servant-born boys ever became knights. Knighthood required money, training, armor, horses, connections. Most ended up as guards at best, men with spears, paid just enough to survive, expendable, replaceable. Girls, meanwhile, were absorbed deeper into domestic labor: cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare. By their early teens, many were already doing the work of adult women and being treated like them too. Which brings us, gently and calmly, to marriage. Marriage for non-noble girls inside castles was not romantic. It was logistical. If a girl had a family connection in a nearby village, she might be married off quickly. One less mouth to feed. One less responsibility for the castle household. If she didn't, she stayed. Some became lifelong servants, unmarried, living in shared quarters, growing older inside the same walls they'd known since birth. Others became involved with men inside the castle, servants, soldiers, occasionally someone higher ranking. And this is where things quietly repeat. Pregnancy happened, often without ceremony, often without protection. A servant woman who became pregnant did not stop working, not until she physically couldn't. And when the child was born, the cycle continued. A new non-noble child, inside the same stone walls, born into the same invisible class. Now let's talk about discipline, because castles were very calm places, except when they absolutely were not. Children were disciplined publicly. Shame mattered. Fear worked. Punishments ranged from extra labor to physical correction. Nothing theatrical, nothing dramatic. Just enough pain to teach a lesson, and to remind everyone else to behave. And if a child stole food, that was serious. Hunger was understood, but property was sacred. Now, some children did manage to leave the castle permanently. A boy might be sent to a monastery, not because he was holy, but because monasteries needed labor too. A girl might marry and move away, trade stone walls for a wooden house and a field. But many came back. Castles had gravity. They pulled people in. They promised stability in a world that had very little of it. Food, however basic. Shelter, however cold. Work, however exhausting. Outside the castle, things were worse. And so entire families became generational servants. Grandparents, parents, children, all serving the same noble line, watching noble families rise, fall, intermarry, and decay. Servant children saw noble children die young. They saw queens cry. They saw kings rage. They learned very early that power did not equal happiness, but it did equal safety, and they had neither. During times of war, things tightened. Supplies were counted. Rations shrank. Work increased. Children carried stones, fetched arrows, moved water. They were useful because they were small, and because they were not considered worth protecting. If a siege lasted long enough, servant children weakened first. They got quieter, slower, and if the castle fell, history looks away again. No chronicles list their names. No paintings show their faces. They disappear from the record entirely, as if stone walls swallowed them whole. By adulthood, the lucky ones survived into a strange middle age, still working, still serving. Their bodies bent early, their hands rough, their futures already finished. They might watch a new generation of noble children grow up, hear the same lessons repeated, see the same mistakes made, and they would teach their own children how to survive quietly, where to stand, when to speak, how not to be noticed, because castles did not belong to them, but they belonged to the castle. And when they died, often buried nearby, unmarked, unremembered, the castle remained, stone outlasting flesh, as always. So let's take another slow breath. Let the torches dim. Let the corridors empty. Because next time, we'll drift even further, into illness, into abandonment, into the rare moments when a servant child almost escaped their fate. Almost, but not yet.
All right, welcome back. If your eyes are heavy, good. If you forgot what day it is, even better. That means the castle walls are doing their job. Last time, we left our servant children grown, bent a little early, tired a little too soon, still alive, which in medieval terms counted as success. So now let's drift into the quieter disasters, the ones that didn't make noise, the ones history rarely bothers to name. Let's start with sickness. Castles were perfect places for illness to settle in and never leave. Stone walls trapped moisture. People lived close together. Animals lived close too, sometimes uncomfortably close. If a noble child fell ill, there were doctors, or at least men who believed they were doctors. Herbs, prayers, bleeding, hope. If a servant child fell ill, there was rest, briefly, and then work again, if they could stand. If they couldn't, someone else took their place. Sick children were not isolated. They slept where they always slept, among others. Illness spread slowly and patiently. Fevers, coughs that never stopped, skin infections that worsened quietly. Many children didn't die dramatically. They faded, worked slower, missed meals, stopped being useful. And usefulness was everything. Some were sent away when they became too weak, back to villages, to relatives who might take them in, or might not. Others stayed until they died, and their absence was filled before anyone had time to miss them. Now let's talk about abandonment. Not the dramatic kind, the administrative kind. Sometimes a castle changed hands. A lord died. A new family moved in. Staff was reduced. Servant families who had lived there for generations were suddenly unnecessary, children included. They were dismissed with nothing. No savings, no land. Just the knowledge of castle life, which was mostly useless outside stone walls. Some survived, some didn't. And some children were abandoned without ever leaving the castle. Illegitimate children. Children born of affairs that became inconvenient. Children whose existence caused problems. They were
All right. Settle back in again. If you're still awake, don't worry. The castle hasn't noticed you yet. It rarely does. So far, we've followed these children through birth, labor, sickness, and adulthood. But castles, like all things built by humans with too much confidence, eventually change. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And when castles changed, non-noble children felt it first. Because castles were not eternal homes, they were political tools. And when power shifted, the stone stayed, but the people didn't always get to. Let's talk about decline, the quiet kind. Not every castle fell in a dramatic siege. Most simply faded. A noble family ran out of money. Wars drained treasuries. Trade routes shifted. New residences were built somewhere warmer, somewhere with bigger windows. The lord left. The court moved on. And suddenly, the castle wasn't a center of life anymore. It was a shell. For nobles, this meant relocation. For servants and their children, it meant uncertainty. Some families were dismissed outright, told to leave the only home they had ever known. No compensation, no plan. Others were kept on, but in reduced numbers. A skeleton staff, enough to keep the place functional. Barely. Children growing up in these half-empty castles lived among echoes, empty halls, unused chambers, rooms that once hosted feasts now collecting dust. Work still existed, but it felt pointless, maintaining something no one cared about anymore. And psychologically, this mattered. A full castle was harsh but predictable. A dying castle was worse. Because now, survival depended on guessing how long the place would remain useful, and whether you should leave before it abandoned you completely. Some did leave. Former servant children, now adults, moved to towns, joined guilds if they could, became laborers, became poor in new ways. They traded stone walls for overcrowded streets, cold corridors for disease-ridden alleys. Life outside the castle was not freedom, it was just different. Others stayed until the very end. These were often older servants, people who had nowhere else to go, people whose entire identity was wrapped up in the castle. Their children grew up in ruins, literally. They played in collapsed towers, ran through unused battlements, learned not to step where floors had rotted away. The castle became less of a workplace and more of a ghost. And then there were abandoned castles, places left completely empty by nobility, left behind after wars or political shifts. Sometimes servant families stayed anyway, squatting essentially, using what remained, growing food nearby, living among the stones. Children born in these abandoned castles had a strange upbringing. No lord, no court, no hierarchy, at least not the old one, but also no protection. These children grew up among ruins and memories, stories passed down about how things used to be, about great halls filled with light, about nobles who mattered. To them, it sounded like mythology. Now, occasionally, a castle did fall violently. We won't linger on it. That's not tonight's mood. But it's important to say this gently. When violence happened, servant children were rarely priorities. Evacuations focused on nobles, ransoms focused on elites. Children ran, or hid, or were caught in between. And after, survivors drifted away, absorbed into villages, forgotten quickly. Because history moves on fast after disasters, especially when the victims were already invisible. Let's talk about memory. Servant children did not leave diaries, they did not commission portraits, they did not get statues, but they left traces. Worn steps, smoothed door frames, graffiti scratched into stone, handprints in old plaster. Archaeologists sometimes find small things, a child's shoe, a toy carved from wood, a name scratched where no one was meant to see it. These are the quiet echoes. And when castles became tourist sites centuries later, these children were gone entirely. Visitors admired architecture. They imagined banquets. They imagined nights. They rarely imagined children scrubbing floors at dawn. But those children were the castle's longest residents, longer than any noble family, longer than any dynasty. They were born there. They grew up there. They aged there. And often, they died there. Castles didn't just dominate landscapes, they shaped lives. And when they finally fell silent, it wasn't the nobles who disappeared first. It was the children, already gone, already forgotten. So as we sit here, drifting closer to sleep, imagine one last scene. A castle at twilight. No banners, no music, just wind through broken windows. Somewhere centuries ago, a child learned to walk here, learned to work, learned to endure. No one wrote their name down, but the stone remembers. Take a slow breath. Let that settle. Because in the next part, we'll gently zoom out and talk about why these children mattered, even when history pretended they didn't. All right, we're almost at the end now. The castle is quieter than it's ever been. No footsteps, no orders being shouted down corridors, just stone and time. So in this last stretch, let's zoom out a little, not suddenly, just enough to see the shape of things. Because when we talk about medieval castles, we usually talk about intention. They were built to defend, to intimidate, to display power. But no one ever built a castle for children, especially not for non-noble ones. And yet, children were everywhere. They were born into systems that didn't care if they thrived, only that they functioned. These children were never meant to be remembered. They weren't part of dynastic plans. They weren't bargaining chips in marriages. They weren't heirs. They were labor, future labor. And from a medieval perspective, that was enough. What's strange is how essential they were.
Castles did not run without them. Food didn't appear on tables itself. Fires didn't stay lit. Floors didn't clean themselves. All smooth-running households depended on people who started working as children. And yet, the system never paused to ask what that did to them. Emotionally, these children learned something very early. They learned that the world was not fair, and more importantly, that fairness was not expected. They didn't grow up believing effort led to reward. They believed effort led to survival, and that shaped everything. They formed tight bonds with siblings and friends because family was all you had. Loyalty mattered. Silence mattered. You didn't dream loudly. You dreamed carefully, privately, if at all. Many of these children developed a kind of emotional flatness, not because they felt nothing, but because feeling too much was dangerous. Grief had to be swallowed. Anger had to be hidden. Hope had to be rationed. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was adaptation. Now, here's the part history rarely acknowledges. These children were not passive. They weren't mindless background figures. They learned systems. They learned power dynamics. They knew which nobles were cruel and which were merely tired. They knew when to avoid hallways. They knew how to bend rules quietly. They survived. In small, invisible ways. Some stole moments of rest. Some passed food to each other. Some protected younger children when no one was watching. These weren't heroic acts. They were human ones. And that's the part that gets lost. When castles finally faded into ruins, when monarchies shifted, when history books were written, these children were already gone. But their influence remained. They raised the next generation of workers. They passed down habits of caution. They shaped village cultures after leaving castle life. In a very quiet way, they carried medieval society forward. Even now, when you walk through a castle ruin, you're walking through their work. The stairs worn down by small feet, the corners smoothed by generations of hands, the paths between rooms made practical by people who moved quickly and often. Kings came and went, dynasties collapsed, but servant children were constant. They were the most stable.
All right. If you're still with me, you're doing great. If you're not, honestly, that's even better. By now, the castle has been empty for a while. Not dramatically empty, just unattended. The banners are gone. The nobles are long buried somewhere expensive. The servants' quarters are collapsing quietly, as if they know no one is watching. And the children? They're not here anymore either, not physically. But this is the strange thing about places like castles. They remember people better than books do. Long after the last child carried water down these halls, the stone kept the routine. The paths still curve where small feet learned the fastest routes. Doorways are smoothed at hand height. Steps are worn down unevenly because everyone favored the same side when they climbed. This wasn't architecture, it was habit. Centuries pass. Grass grows where courtyards once echoed with orders. Birds nest in towers that once terrified entire villages. And eventually, someone comes along and calls it a ruin. Ruins are funny things. They make people nostalgic for lives they would never want to live. Visitors walk through and imagine feasts. They imagine gowns. They imagine power. They almost never imagine children working before sunrise. They don't imagine a 10-year-old who already knew how to stay invisible. They don't imagine a life where the castle was home, employer, threat, and future, all at once. But those children were the castle's longest relationship. Noble families changed constantly. Staff rotated. Politics shifted. But children born into service kept arriving, generation after generation. They didn't inherit titles, they inherited knowledge. where the walls leaked, which winters were the worst, how to read a lord's mood from footsteps alone. That kind of knowledge doesn't show up in archives, but it kept castles alive. And when castles died, that knowledge went with them. Some of those children grew old in villages nearby. They told stories to grandchildren who barely believed them. You lived inside the castle? Yes. What was it like? Cold, busy, normal. Because to them, it was. Others left no descendants at all. Plagues saw to that. So did hunger. So did exhaustion. Their entire existence compressed into worn stone and unmarked ground. And yet, here we are, talking about them, very slowly, very calmly, which is more than they ever got while they were alive. So maybe this part, this quiet afterword, isn't really about castles at all. It's about noticing the background people, the ones history treated like furniture, necessary, replaceable, and never thanked. The children who weren't meant to matter, but somehow held everything together anyway. And now, finally, they get to rest, at least in our imagination. So let the castle stay quiet. Let the walls crumble without witnesses. Let the ghosts remain unnamed. You don't need to remember dates. You don't need to remember facts. Just remember that history was crowded, and most of it belonged to people no one planned to write about. That's all. Get some sleep. we're still here, which means either you really like medieval social history or you're halfway asleep and letting this roll in the background. Both are correct choices. By now, the castle is no longer a place. It's more like a habit your mind hasn't let go of yet. So let's stay with that feeling. Because even after castles fell into ruin, even after their stones were recycled into farmhouses and churches, the idea of the castle lingered. And so did the people shaped by it. Former castle children didn't suddenly become different people once they left. They carried the castle with them, not emotionally, practically. They organized their lives the way castles had organized them. Work first, rest when allowed, speak carefully, notice everything. If you trace medieval village life closely enough, you can see it. A quiet efficiency, an acceptance of hierarchy without affection for it. A deep understanding that authority was real but temporary. That mindset didn't come from books. It came from childhoods spent watching power from the wrong side of the door. Now, here's something subtle. Castles trained children to understand absence. They learned to live around locked rooms, private chambers, forbidden staircases. They learned that some spaces were simply not meant for them, and that lesson stuck. Even generations later, people descended from castle servants tended to respect boundaries instinctively, not out of loyalty, out of habit. They didn't challenge authority head-on. They waited, they adapted, they endured. Which is why so many medieval systems lasted longer than they probably should have. Now let's talk about silence. Castle children learned silence early, not total silence, but selective silence. Knowing when not to speak was a skill, a survival tool. And that skill passed down culturally. In folk traditions, you often see clever characters who survive by saying very little, by observing, by waiting for the right moment. That's not accidental. Those stories came from people who learned early that speaking freely was a luxury. And yet, silence didn't mean emptiness. These children had inner lives, rich ones. They noticed patterns, they remembered faces, they connected small details. They understood people better than people understood them. Which brings us to memory. Not written memory, lived memory. Castles created generations of people who remembered without recording. They didn't write things down, they knew them. Which lord favored which servant, which family had a history of cruelty, which seasons brought the most illness. That kind of memory was passed orally, casually, at hearths, in kitchens, while working. And when castles vanished, that memory didn't disappear. It just detached from the stone. It moved into communities. This is why some villages had long-standing mistrust of certain noble families, even centuries later, even when no one remembered why. It was inherited caution. Now, let's slow things down even more. Imagine a child born in a village near an old castle ruin. They grow up hearing vague stories. There used to be people there. My grandmother worked there. It wasn't as nice as it looked. No details, just impressions. That child grows up with a quiet understanding that big buildings mean control, that beauty often hides labor, that power is something to approach sideways. They don't know where they learned that, but it shapes them anyway. And that's the final quiet influence of castle children. They didn't change history loudly. They changed how people felt about it. About authority, about work, about survival. And those feelings outlasted the Middle Ages. So when we imagine medieval castles today, glowing at sunset, standing proudly on hills, we should also imagine the softer image. A child walking quickly down a corridor,
eyes lowered, mind alert. Not a hero, not a victim in a dramatic sense, just a person adapting. And maybe that's the most honest way to understand the past, not as a series of great events, but as millions of ordinary adjustments made by people who had no choice. Children born inside castles without titles didn't ask to be part of history, but history happened through them anyway. Quietly, daily, without applause. So now, really, this is the end. No lesson, no dramatic takeaway. Just the understanding that the past was crowded, and most of it was lived by people who learned very early how to take up as little space as possible. You can let the castle fade now. Let the echoes stop. There's nothing left you need to remember. Good night. All right, we're still drifting. At this point, the castle isn't really a castle anymore. It's more like a shape your mind recognizes, a structure made of routine, not stone. And that's appropriate. Because for non-noble children, castles were never symbols, they were schedules. Wake up, move, wait, listen, work. That rhythm didn't end when childhood ended, it followed them. Former castle children carried endurance like a second spine, invisible, load-bearing. They didn't think of themselves as resilient. That word came much later. They just thought of themselves as normal. Which is always the strangest part of history. What we now call harsh conditions, they called how things are. When they entered adulthood, many of them had already experienced more responsibility than most modern adults ever will. They had managed households, raised siblings, worked under pressure without explanation. And because of that, they rarely expected fairness. Expectation is a luxury. Castles taught children not to rely on it. This shaped how they reacted to the world. They didn't protest loudly, they adjusted quietly. If food was scarce, they ate less. If work increased, they paced themselves. If authority changed, they observed first. That doesn't mean they agreed, it means they survived. And survival has a way of looking like acceptance from the outside. Now, here's something that often gets misunderstood. These children were not joyless. They found joy where it was allowed, in small places. A warm corner of a kitchen, a shared joke whispered while folding linen, a moment of sunlight in a stairwell. Their happiness was portable, compact. It had to be. Large dreams were dangerous, small pleasures were safer. And this shaped medieval emotional culture more than we like to admit. There's a reason medieval humor is dry, why folk songs are repetitive, why comfort comes from familiarity. That emotional minimalism didn't come from philosophy, it came from lived constraint. Now, imagine these people as parents. Former castle children raising children of their own. They were practical parents, not indulgent, not cruel, just focused. They taught skills early, they expected competence, they corrected quietly. Affection existed, but it wasn't performative. Love was shown through preparation. Here's how you carry that. Here's where you stand. Here's what you don't say. That was care. And their children absorbed that tone. So even generations removed from castle life, you still see the echo. A calm acceptance of hardship, a skepticism toward authority, a focus on doing rather than explaining. These aren't medieval traits, they're survival traits. Castles just concentrated them. Now let's talk about forgetting. Not forgetting as loss, but forgetting as mercy. Many former castle children didn't want to remember every detail, not because it was traumatic in a modern sense, but because it was heavy. Memory takes energy. They preferred to use that energy on living. So stories blurred, specifics faded. What remained were patterns. We worked a lot. It was cold. You stayed out of the way. That's how entire childhoods compressed into a few sentences. And historians much later looked at those sentences and struggled, because they wanted drama, they wanted turning points. But these lives didn't have many. They had continuity. And continuity is hard to narrate. That's why these children rarely appear in records, not because they were rare, but because they were constant. Now one last slow image. A market town, centuries ago. An older person stands quietly near a stall. They don't huggle loud.
All right. We're still not done. Not because there's some dramatic ending waiting, but because ordinary lives don't end neatly. They just thin out. So let's stay a little longer. By now, the castle exists mostly as memory. Not even a clear one. More like a pressure in the background of people's lives. And that pressure shaped more than just work habits. It shaped how people thought about themselves. Non-noble children born inside castles grew up knowing something very specific. They were inside power, but never part of it. That distinction mattered. They weren't outsiders looking in from afar. They saw everything up close. They saw nobles argue over trivial things. They saw luxury fail to prevent illness. They saw authority panic when plans collapsed. So from a very young age, they learned something quietly subversive. Power wasn't magical. It was fragile, and often badly managed. But knowing that didn't give them power in return. It only gave them awareness. And awareness without agency is a heavy thing to carry. These children grew up careful not because they were obedient, but because they understood consequences better than most adults. They saw what happened when someone spoke too freely, when a servant trusted the wrong noble, when a rumor reached the wrong ears. So they learned to edit themselves. Not completely, just enough. That self-editing followed them into adulthood. They became people who chose words carefully, who noticed tone before content, who understood that silence could be strategic. In modern terms, we might call them emotionally intelligent. In medieval terms, they were simply well-trained. Now let's add something we haven't lingered on enough yet. Religion. Castles were religious places. Chapels. Daily prayers. Endless reminders of sin, obedience, and divine order. Non-noble children absorbed this too. But they absorbed it differently than nobles did. For nobles, religion justified power. For servants, religion explained suffering. Children were told that hardship had meaning, that endurance was virtuous, that reward came later. These ideas didn't make life easier, but they made it bearable. And children learned early how to compartmentalize pain.
physical pain, emotional disappointment, loss. They learned to tuck it away somewhere quiet and keep moving. This wasn't blind faith. It was practical theology. Now consider friendships. Castle children formed intense bonds with each other. Not sentimental ones, functional ones. You relied on people who worked beside you. You trusted those who shared your pace. These friendships often lasted decades, sometimes lifetimes. Even when people left the castle, they looked for others like themselves. People who moved the same way, who didn't waste words, who understood hierarchy without explaining it. Communities formed quietly around shared experience. This is one reason medieval lower-class communities were surprisingly stable despite constant hardship. People knew how to cooperate under pressure. They'd practiced since childhood. Now, let's talk about rest again. Castle children learned that rest was conditional, temporary, earned. They didn't expect comfort. They accepted it when it appeared. This shaped their relationship with pleasure. They didn't chase luxury. They didn't envy it the way we might expect. They understood luxury as something fragile, temporary, often followed by loss. Instead, they valued predictability, a steady fire, enough food, a roof that didn't leak too badly. This preference carried forward culturally. Stability became more desirable than ambition. And that's important, because it explains why so many medieval societies changed slowly. Not because people lacked imagination, but because too much change felt dangerous. Children raised inside castles understood how quickly power could rearrange lives. They learned caution early. Now, let's add one more layer. Migration. As castles declined, many former castle children or their descendants moved. They took jobs in towns, in workshops, in emerging industries. And they brought castle discipline with them. Town records often mention workers who were reliable, quiet, and efficient. These were often people with backgrounds tied to noble households. They didn't stand out socially, but they made systems work. Again, infrastructure. Now, imagine one of these people late in life. They sit near a wall, not in the center of the room. They listen more than they speak. They notice patterns others miss. They're not nostalgic. They don't romanticize the past. When someone complains about hardship, they nod. They've seen worse. But they don't boast about it. Survival wasn't a badge of honor. It was just something you did. And this is where modern audiences often misread the past.
We expect trauma to announce itself loudly. We expect suffering to leave dramatic marks. But for these children, suffering was ambient, like weather. You adapted to it. You dressed for it. You didn't talk about it endlessly. And that adaptation shaped entire cultures. Now let's pause on something gentle. Despite everything, these children were not devoid of imagination. They imagined small futures, a better position, a warmer room, a child who wouldn't have to start work quite so early. These weren't revolutionary dreams. They were incremental ones. And those incremental improvements mattered. Over generations, childhood lengthened. Work started later. Education spread. Not because nobles suddenly became kind, but because people quietly pushed boundaries from below. Castle children didn't overthrow systems. They slowly wore them down, just like they wore down stone steps. And finally, let's talk about legacy.
All right, we're still here. Not because there's something important left to uncover, but because some lives don't end with a conclusion. They just settle. By now, the idea of a castle child has blurred. It's no longer a single image, not a barefoot servant running through halls. It's a type of person. Someone shaped early by proximity to power. Someone who learned limits before learning dreams. And that shape didn't vanish when castles lost relevance. As the medieval world slowly slid into something else, early modern bureaucracy, towns, trade, paperwork, these people adjusted quietly. They always did. Former castle children entered new systems already trained for them. Schedules didn't scare them. Hierarchy didn't confuse them. Repetition felt familiar. They became clerks, artisans, assistants, people whose names appear in records without explanation. And that's the point. They didn't need explanation. They fit. Now here's something subtle we haven't really paused on. These people rarely describe themselves as unlucky. That sounds strange, because by modern standards, their childhoods were harsh. But luck implies comparison, and comparison requires options. They didn't compare their lives to noble children. That gap was too wide to be useful. They compared their lives to chaos, and castles, for all their cruelty, were structured. There was food, even if it was plain, shelter, even if it was cold, rules, even if they were unfair. So many castle children grew up believing, quietly, internally, that order mattered more than comfort. This belief shaped entire work cultures later on. People valued clear expectations. They preferred predictable authority to unpredictable freedom. Not because they were afraid, but because they had seen what disorder looked like up close. Now let's talk about storytelling, or rather, the lack of it. Most former castle children didn't tell stories about their childhoods, not long ones. When asked, they gave summaries. It was busy. You worked. That's how it was. Modern listeners hear avoidance, but it wasn't. It was efficiency. Long stories required emotional excavation. They didn't see the benefit. Why dig into something that no longer needed solving? This is why so much of medieval lower-class life feels empty in historical records. It's not that nothing happened, it's that people didn't flame their lives as narratives. They framed them as sequences of tasks, and sequences don't beg to be remembered. Now imagine this passing forward again. children raised by former castle children. These kids didn't grow up inside castles, but they inherited habits. They were taught to be useful early, to observe before speaking, to respect systems without worshipping them. They learned that stability came from cooperation, not attention. And slowly, across generations, something shifted. Childhood expanded slightly. Rest became a little less conditional. Authority became a bit more distant. Not because anyone planned it, but because habits softened over time. This is how real change happens, quietly, without announcements. Now let's talk about death, but calmly. When former castle children died, it wasn't dramatic, no final speeches. They were buried simply, sometimes without markers. And yet, their influence lingered. In how households ran, in how work was organized, in how people responded to pressure. You can remove a castle from a landscape faster than you can remove the habits it created. Now here's a thought to sit with. If history were written based on impact rather than status, these children would matter a great deal. They didn't rule, they didn't rebel, they maintained. And maintenance is invisible until it stops. So as we let this part wind down, there's no lesson to extract. Just a quiet acknowledgement that most human progress is carried forward by people who never asked to be remembered. They weren't background characters, they were the background. All right, let that settle. Part 13. After the walls were gone. Okay, this is the last place we'll stop. Not because everything has been said, but because nothing needs to be added. By now, the castles aren't even a memory. It's a silhouette, something you recognize only when you're told what it used to be. Grass grows where corridors once guided footsteps. Birds nest where banners once hung. And yet, something remains. Not in stone, in behavior. The children who once lived inside those walls learned a very specific skill early on: how to exist without being centered. They learned to move through systems without reshaping them, to survive without visibility, and that skill outlived the system itself. Long after castles stopped being relevant, people still acted as if they were inside them. They waited their turn. They lowered their voices around authority. They accepted inconvenience as normal, not because they were taught explicitly, but because culture teaches quietly. Now here's something gentle to sit with. Many modern people feel tired without knowing why. They feel pressure without a clear source. They feel like rest must be earned. That feeling didn't begin in offices or factories. It began much earlier, with children who learned that stillness was safety, that usefulness was protection, that being noticed could be risky. Those lessons didn't disappear when childhood ended. They passed forward like posture. Now imagine someone generations later. They've never seen a castle. They don't know medieval history. They've never heard of feudal systems. But they still apologize for resting, still feel guilty for idleness, still equate value with productivity. That's an echo, a very old one, and echoes don't announce where they come from. Now let's soften this further. This isn't about blame or guilt. The children born inside medieval castles weren't victims in a modern moral framework. They were participants in a world that demanded adaptation. And adaptation worked. It kept societies functioning. It kept people alive. Without them, things would have collapsed far more often. So there's a quiet dignity here. Not heroism, not martyrdom, competence. The kind that doesn't ask for applause. Now let's return to childhood one last time. Castle children didn't have much time to imagine who they might become, but they developed a strong sense of who they couldn't be. They couldn't be reckless. They couldn't be loud. They couldn't afford mistakes. That limitation shaped maturity early. They became adults who planned ahead, who expected little, who rarely felt surprised by disappointment. And strangely, that made them stable. Not happy, not fulfilled, stable. Stability became the quiet goal of generations. And stability, when repeated long enough, becomes tradition. Now here's a subtle shift worth noticing. Over centuries, as life conditions improved slightly, those same habits began to feel heavy. What once protected people began to constrain them. Endurance turned into burnout, restraint turned into emotional distance. But culture lags behind conditions. So people kept carrying habits designed for survival long after survival required them. And that's where we are now, still living with echoes of stone walls we never touched. Now let's bring this to rest. If we could go back, not to change anything but to observe, we wouldn't find dramatic scenes. We'd find children standing quietly, watching adults, learning rules without asking. And those children wouldn't think they were shaping the future. They were just trying to get through the day. And yet, they did. Their quiet persistence carried forward into centuries they would never see. That's not a grand legacy, but it's a real one. So as this part fades away, there's nothing you need to hold on to. No lesson to apply tonight. Just an awareness that some tiredness is inherited, some restraint is historical, some habits were once necessary. And you don't need to solve that right now. You can just rest. The echo doesn't need you to listen anymore. Good night.
Part 15. When endurance became a personality. All right. We'll continue. By this point in history, endurance isn't just something people do, it's something people are. Former castle children, now long dead, left behind more than habits. They left behind expectations. Expectations about what a good person looks like. Quiet, reliable, doesn't complain too much, shows up. These traits became moralized, not officially, just culturally. People who endured were praised. People who struggled openly were gently discouraged. And this didn't happen because anyone was cruel. It happened because endurance had worked before. When systems were fragile, endurance kept them. Now imagine growing up in a world where endurance is admired more than curiosity, where being easy to manage is considered a virtue. That world didn't start with factories. It started much earlier, with children who learned that standing out could be dangerous. So they blended in, and blending in became respectable. Now let's sit with something uncomfortable but quiet. Many former castle children didn't know what they wanted, not because they lacked desire, but because desire had never been safe to explore. They knew what was expected. They knew what was allowed. So they lived inside those boundaries. And over time, boundaries became identity. This is how whole cultures become emotionally modest. Not repressed, just contained. Feelings existed, they just didn't spill. Now drift forward again. As societies modernized, people inherited these emotional limits without the original context. They were told to work hard, be patient, wait their turn. But no one explained why those values existed in the first place. So people followed them automatically. Endurance without explanation can feel hollow, and hollow things are heavy. All right, let's keep going.
All right, we're still here. Not because there's something important left to uncover, but because some lives don't end with a conclusion, they just settle. By now, the idea of a castle child has blurred. It's no longer a single image, not a barefoot servant running through halls. It's a type of person. Someone shaped early by proximity to power. Someone who learned limits before learning dreams. And that shape didn't vanish when castles lost relevance. As the medieval world slowly slid into something else, early modern bureaucracy, towns, trade, paperwork, these people adjusted quietly. They always did. Former castle children entered new systems already trained for them. Schedules didn't scare them. Hierarchy didn't confuse them. Repetition felt familiar. They became clerks, artisans, assistants, people whose names appear in records without explanation. And that's the point. They didn't need explanation. They fit. Now here's something subtle we haven't really paused on. These people rarely describe themselves as unlucky. That sounds strange, because by modern standards, their childhoods were harsh. But luck implies comparison, and comparison requires options. They didn't compare their lives to noble children. That gap was too wide to be useful. They compared their lives to chaos, and castles, for all their cruelty, were structured. There was food, even if it was plain, shelter, even if it was cold, rules, even if they were unfair. So many castle children grew up believing, quietly, internally, that order mattered more than comfort. This belief shaped entire work cultures later on. People valued clear expectations. They preferred predictable authority to unpredictable freedom. Not because they were afraid, but because they had seen what disorder looked like up close. Now let's talk about storytelling, or rather, the lack of it. Most former castle children didn't tell stories about their childhoods, not long ones. When asked, they gave summaries. It was busy. You worked. That's how it was. Modern listeners hear avoidance, but it wasn't. It was efficiency. Long stories required emotional excavation. They didn't see the benefit. Why dig into something that no longer needed solving? This is why so much of medieval lower-class life feels empty in historical records. It's not that nothing happened, it's that people didn't frame their lives as narratives. They framed them as sequences of tasks, and sequences don't beg to be remembered. Now imagine this passing forward again. Children raised by former castle children. These kids didn't grow up inside castles, but they inherited habits. They were taught to be useful early, to observe before speaking, to respect systems without worshipping them. They learned that stability came from cooperation, not attention. And slowly, across generations, something shifted. Childhood expanded slightly. Rest became a little less conditional. Authority became a bit more distant. Not because anyone planned it, but because habits softened over time. This is how real change happens, quietly, without announcements. Now let's talk about death, but calmly. When former castle children died, it wasn't dramatic, no final speeches. They were buried simply, sometimes without markers. And yet, their influence lingered. In how households ran, in how work was organized, in how people responded to pressure. You can remove a castle from a landscape faster than you can remove the habits it created. Now here's a thought to sit with. If history were written based on impact rather than status, these children would matter a great deal. They didn't rule, they didn't rebel, they maintained. And maintenance is invisible until it stops. So as we let this part wind down, there's no lesson to extract. Just a quiet acknowledgement that most human progress is carried forward by people who never asked to be remembered. They weren't background characters. They were the background. All right, let that settle. Part 13. After the walls were gone. Okay, this is the last place we'll stop. Not because everything has been said, but because nothing needs to be added.
By now, the castles aren't even a memory. It's a silhouette, something you recognize only when you're told what it used to be. Grass grows where corridors once guided footsteps. Birds nest where banners once hung. And yet, something remains. Not in stone, in behavior. The children who once lived inside those walls learned a very specific skill early on: how to exist without being centered. They learned to move through systems without reshaping them, to survive without visibility, and that skill outlived the system itself. Long after castles stopped being relevant, people still acted as if they were inside them. They waited their turn. They lowered their voices around authority. They accepted inconvenience as normal, not because they were taught explicitly, but because culture teaches quietly. Now here's something gentle to sit with. Many modern people feel tired without knowing why. They feel pressure without a clear source. They feel like rest must be earned. That feeling didn't begin in offices or factories. It began much earlier, with children who learned that stillness was safety, that usefulness was protection, that being noticed could be risky. Those lessons didn't disappear when childhood ended. They passed forward like posture. Now imagine someone generations later. They've never seen a castle. They don't know medieval history. They've never heard of feudal systems. But they still apologize for resting, still feel guilty for idleness, still equate value with productivity. That's an echo, a very old one, and echoes don't announce where they come from. Now let's soften this further. This isn't about blame or guilt. The children born inside medieval castles weren't victims in a modern moral framework. They were participants in a world that demanded adaptation. And adaptation worked. It kept societies functioning. It kept people alive. Without them, things would have collapsed far more often. So there's a quiet dignity here. Not heroism, not martyrdom, competence. The kind that doesn't ask for applause. Now let's return to childhood one last time. Castle children didn't have much time to imagine who they might become, but they developed a strong sense of who they couldn't be. They couldn't be reckless. They couldn't be loud. They couldn't afford mistakes. That limitation shaped maturity early. They became adults who planned ahead, who expected little, who rarely felt surprised by disappointment. And strangely, that made them stable. Not happy, not fulfilled, stable. Stability became the quiet goal of generations. And stability, when repeated long enough, becomes tradition. Now here's a subtle shift worth noticing. Over centuries, as life conditions improved slightly, those same habits began to feel heavy. What once protected people began to constrain them. Endurance turned into burnout. Restraint turned into emotional distance. But culture lags behind conditions. So people kept carrying habits designed for survival long after survival required them. And that's where we are now. Still living with echoes of stone walls we never touched. Now let's bring this to rest. If we could go back, not to change anything but to observe, we wouldn't find dramatic scenes. We'd find children standing quietly, watching adults, learning rules without asking. And those children wouldn't think they were shaping the future. They were just trying to get through the day. And yet, they did. Their quiet persistence carried forward into centuries they would never see. That's not a grand legacy, but it's a real one. So as this part fades away, there's nothing you need to hold on to. No lesson to apply tonight. Just an awareness that some tiredness is inherited, some restraint is historical, some habits were once necessary. And you don't need to solve that right now. You can just rest. The echo doesn't need you to listen anymore. Good night.
All right. We're not going anywhere new. This part exists for the same reason silence exists after a long day. Not because there's more to say, but because stopping too quickly feels wrong. So we sit. By now, the children born inside medieval castles who weren't nobles have completely dissolved into time. No faces, no names, no clear edges. And that's okay. Because most real influence doesn't leave sharp outlines. It spreads, it softens, it becomes background. Those children didn't imagine futures, they adjusted to conditions. They learned when to move, when to wait, when to speak, when silence was safer. And those instincts, learned early, shaped how entire populations learned to exist inside systems, not just feudal ones, any system. Now imagine a moment that has nothing medieval about it. Someone stands in a quiet room, nothing urgent happening, no authority nearby, and yet their body feels slightly alert, as if something might be expected. That alertness didn't appear randomly. It's the echo of centuries where attention mattered, where mistakes were remembered, where being useful was protection. Those children learned vigilance before they learned comfort, and vigilance is very good at surviving long past its usefulness. Now let's slow this down even more. Castle childhoods trained people to notice absence. Absence of food, absence of warmth, absence of patience from authority. So children grew into adults who scanned environments automatically. What's missing? What's about to change? What should I prepare for? This constant low-level scanning became normal, not stressful, just present. And when those people raised children of their own, they didn't teach vigilance directly, they modeled it. Children learn tone before instruction. They learn what to expect by watching how adults move through rooms. So vigilance passed down silently. Now fast forward again. Modern people often describe a vague restlessness, a sense of unease during calm moments. They assume something is wrong, but sometimes nothing is wrong. The body just learned its lessons in a different century. Now here's something important to sit with. This history isn't trying to control you. It's not demanding loyalty. It's just unfinished muscle memory. And muscle memory fades slowly, especially when it kept people alive. Now imagine the final image of this entire series. Not a castle, not a child, just a space. Empty, safe, unstructured. No roles assigned, no expectations hovering. At first, it feels unfamiliar. Unstructured spaces always do to people raised inside systems. But slowly, the body adjusts. The shoulders drop. The breath deepens. History doesn't resist this. It doesn't need you tense. It's already complete. The children who carried endurance did their job. They kept society standing long enough for change to happen. You don't need to continue their vigilance tonight. You can let it rest. So we sit here at the very end without analysis. No takeaway, no closing argument, just quiet permission. Permission to stop carrying old postures, permission to let ancient alertness dissolve. The story has ended, and unlike those children long ago, you're allowed to stop when it does. All right, that's enough. There's nothing left to listen for. Sleep can take it from here. All right. We're still here, not because history demands it, not because there's another thread to pull. We're here because sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stop doing anything at all. By this point, the medieval castle is completely gone. Not ruined, not abandoned, gone. There are no walls to lean against, no corridors to memorize, no authority footsteps to anticipate. And yet, the posture remains. That posture, the quiet readiness, the slight tension, the habit of waiting, was never about stone. It was about uncertainty.
Children born inside medieval castles who weren't nobles learned early that uncertainty required preparation. You didn't wait for instructions, you watched, you adjusted. That skill kept you fed, it kept you out of trouble, it kept you alive. And skills that save lives don't disappear easily. They settle into the body, into breathing patterns, into how silence feels. Now let's slow down even more. Imagine a moment where nothing is expected of you. No deadline, no role, no evaluation. For many people, that moment feels uncomfortable. Not painful, just unfamiliar. The mind searches for something to do. The body stays slightly alert. This isn't restlessness from boredom, it's vigilance without a target. And that vigilance has a history. Castle children didn't get idle time, they got pauses between tasks. Pauses weren't safe, they were temporary. So they learned to treat stillness as something that might end at any second. That lesson carried forward long after castles stopped shaping daily life. Now here's something gentle to acknowledge. There's nothing wrong with you if rest feels strange. There's nothing broken if calm feels unfinished. Those feelings didn't start with you. They started with people who lived in systems where readiness mattered more than comfort. And they were right. At the time. Now imagine one of the original castle children near the end of their life. Not reflective, not philosophical, just tired. They don't review their childhood as trauma or triumph. They think of it as weather. Cold seasons, busy seasons. They don't miss it. They don't resent it. It simply was. That emotional neutrality is worth noticing, because modern people often feel pressured to label the past. Good, bad, unfair, inspiring. But for most of history's participants, life wasn't categorized, it was endured. And endurance doesn't come with commentary. Now let's talk about stillness. Castle children didn't get much of it. Even rest was conditional. Even sleep could be interrupted. So they learned to rest lightly, always partially awake. That habit passed down too. People who can't fully relax without guilt, who feel unproductive during stillness. That's not personal failure, it's inherited caution. And caution makes sense in a world that once punished idleness. But here's the quiet shift. That world doesn't exist anymore, and the body hasn't fully caught up. So part 28 isn't about understanding history better. It's about noticing when your body is responding to rules that are no longer enforced. You don't need to stay alert. You don't need to anticipate punishment. You don't need to earn calm. Those were solutions for stone walls and narrow corridors. You're not there now. Now let's soften further. None of this means you must change anything. There's no instruction here, just recognition. Recognition allows loosening, and loosening happens naturally when pressure is removed. You don't have to tell yourself to relax. You just have to stop telling yourself to brace. Now imagine the final image of this entire series. Not a castle, not a child, just a space. Empty, safe, unstructured. No roles assigned, no expectations hovering. At first, it feels unfamiliar. Unstructured spaces always do to people raised inside systems. But slowly, the body adjusts. The shoulders drop. The breath deepens. History doesn't resist this. It doesn't need you tense. It's already complete. The children who carried endurance did their job. They kept society standing long enough for change to happen. You don't need to continue their vigilance tonight. You can let it rest. So we sit here at the very end without analysis. No takeaway, no closing argument, just quiet permission. Permission to stop carrying old postures, permission to let ancient alertness dissolve. The story has ended, and unlike those children long ago, you're allowed to stop.
All right, we're still here, but there's no pressure attached to that anymore. At some point, every long story reaches a place where it stops asking for attention. Not because it's boring, not because it failed, because it's complete enough. And this is that place. The children born inside medieval castles who weren't nobles began their lives surrounded by expectation, not hope. Expectation. Expectation to be useful, to be quiet, to be observant, to adjust faster than the world adjusted to them. They didn't wake up wondering who they would become. They woke up wondering what would be required. That question shaped everything. And when you live inside a question long enough, it starts to feel like identity. Now here's the slow realization that comes centuries later. You don't live inside that question anymore, but the habit of asking it might still be there. What's next? What should I be doing? What am I missing? These questions feel natural, responsible, even mature, but they come from a time when not asking them had consequences. Castle children learned early that awareness prevented punishment, that preparation reduced harm, that attention was safety. Those lessons worked, which is why they lasted. Now let's slow even further. Imagine a moment where the question never arrives. No what now, no what's expected. Just a stretch of time with no demand attached. For many people, that moment doesn't feel peaceful at first. It feels unfinished, as if something important was forgotten. That discomfort is not intuition, it's conditioning. Castle life trained people to expect interruption, to expect summons, to expect evaluation. So silence felt temporary. And silence that feels temporary can never fully relax. Now fast forward again. You might be sitting somewhere safe, no hierarchy nearby, no punishment coming. And yet, part of you stays alert. That part isn't anxious, it's loyal. Loyal to lessons that once kept people alive. Now here's the quiet truth. Loyalty doesn't have to be permanent. You can honor what worked without continuing to perform it. The children we followed didn't have that option. They had to stay ready. You don't. Now imagine one of those original castle children reaching the end of their life. Not reflective, not poetic, just still. They aren't thinking about legacy. They aren't summarizing meaning. They're tired. And tired people don't want their endurance praised. They want it to stop being necessary. That's something history rarely acknowledges. It loves endurance as an abstract value. It loves resilience as a story. But the people who practiced it mostly wanted rest. And rest was rarely available. So they rested lightly, briefly, with one ear open. That habit passed down too. Now let's soften again. Modern people often talk about being on edge, burned out, always on. They blame technology, work culture, noise. Those things matter, but they didn't create the posture. They just amplified it. The posture was already there, learned by children who had to stay alert in stone corridors where authority could appear without warning. Now let's talk about endings. Not dramatic ones, quiet ones. Most historical lives didn't end with realization. They ended with routine. One day followed another until it didn't. No lesson extracted,
no final insight. And that's okay. Meaning doesn't have to be conscious to be real. The children we followed shaped the world without understanding that they were doing so. And you don't need to understand everything they left behind to release it.
All right. We'll stay very gentle here. By now, nothing is moving forward. Nothing is wrapping up. Nothing is beginning. And that's intentional. Because for the children born inside medieval castles who weren't nobles, life almost never paused without a reason. Everything had to be earned. Food was earned. Warmth was earned. Safety was earned. Even kindness often felt conditional. So the idea of something arriving freely, without effort, without usefulness, was almost unthinkable. They didn't ask for ease. They asked for predictability. Predictability meant survival. And survival doesn't leave much room for softness. Now here's the quiet thing to notice. Many people today still feel like rest has to be deserved. Like you can't fully relax unless you've been productive first, unless you've contributed, unless you've proven something. That feeling doesn't come from laziness. It comes from inheritance. Castle children learned that being idle made you visible. And visibility without protection was dangerous. So rest became something you slipped into quietly, briefly, with awareness. Never fully. That habit didn't vanish when castles disappeared. It moved into households, into workplaces, into personal expectations. Now let's slow this down. Imagine sitting somewhere comfortable. Nothing urgent, nothing wrong. And yet, there's a subtle pressure to justify the moment. To think, I'll rest after I finish this. I'll relax once I deserve it. That internal negotiation didn't begin with you. It began with people whose lives depended on contribution. Now imagine one of those children again. Not as a symbol, not as a lesson, just a person. They didn't resent their life. They didn't analyze it. They adapted. Adaptation doesn't complain, it just reshapes the body. And reshaped bodies pass lessons forward without language. That's how centuries speak quietly. Now here's the soft shift Part 31 is making. You don't need to earn this moment. Not through attention, not through understanding, not through effort. You're allowed to be here without contributing anything back. History isn't keeping score. It already took what it needed. Now let's sit with something even quieter. True rest often feels boring. Not peaceful, not profound, just flat. And flatness feels wrong to minds trained on vigilance. So the mind tries to add meaning, but meaning isn't required here. This part exists to remove requirements. Now imagine a world where nothing is expected of you, not even reflection. No takeaway, no insight, no improvement. Just being. That's not emptiness. That's neutrality. And neutrality is deeply unfamiliar to people shaped by endurance. Castle children lived in gradients of approval and disapproval, permission and restriction. Neutrality didn't exist. So modern neutrality can feel strange, unsettling, but it's safe. Now breathe slowly. There's no cue to watch for, no shift in power, no moment you need to anticipate. You're not about to be evaluated. Nothing changes if you stay still. That realization doesn't feel dramatic. It feels subtle, like something loosening quietly. Now let's talk about fatigue.
Not physical fatigue, existential fatigue. The kind that comes from always being slightly alert, slightly prepared, slightly responsible. Castle children lived inside that fatigue. They didn't name it, they normalized it. And normalization is powerful. It makes exhaustion feel like personality, like duty, like maturity. But it's just fatigue. And fatigue deserves rest without conditions. Now imagine endurance stepping aside, not disappearing, just sitting down, letting someone else carry the moment. That someone else is quiet time. Quiet time doesn't judge, it doesn't rush, it doesn't demand productivity. It just exists. And existence alone is enough here. Part 31 doesn't want to teach you anything. It wants to sit beside you while nothing happens. That's it. No growth, no resolution, just shared stillness. Now the castle is fully gone. Not collapsed, not ruined. Forgotten. And forgotten doesn't mean erased. It means it no longer has authority. The lessons that mattered survived. The vigilance that's no longer needed can fade. You don't need to stay sharp tonight. You don't need to listen closely. Nothing important will be missed. Now let the silence stretch. No timeline, no destination, just time passing gently. That's all. All right, we can stop here. You don't have to stay awake for this. Sleep doesn't need permission either. It can take over whenever it wants. All right. We're still here, but there's no effort left in staying. At this point, even rest has stopped trying to prove itself. It doesn't announce arrival. It doesn't feel dramatic. It just settles. For the children born inside medieval castles who weren't nobles, life almost never settled without a reason. Everything had to be earned. Food was earned, warmth was earned, safety was earned. Even kindness often felt conditional. So the idea of something arriving freely, without effort, without usefulness, was almost unthinkable. They didn't ask for ease, they asked for predictability. Predictability meant survival. And survival doesn't leave much room for softness. Now here's the quiet thing to notice. Many people today still feel like rest has to be deserved. Like you can't fully relax unless you've been productive first, unless you've contributed, unless you've proven something. That feeling doesn't come from laziness, it comes from inheritance. Castle children learned that being idle made you visible, and visibility without protection was dangerous. So rest became something you slipped into quietly, briefly, with awareness. Never fully. That habit didn't vanish when castles disappeared. It moved into households, into workplaces, into personal expectations. Now let's slow this down. Imagine sitting somewhere comfortable. Nothing urgent, nothing wrong, and yet there's a subtle pressure to justify the moment. To think, I'll rest after I finish this. I'll relax once I deserve it. That internal negotiation didn't begin with you. It began with people whose lives depended on contribution. Now imagine one of those children again. Not as a symbol, not as a lesson, just a person. They didn't resent their life. They didn't analyze it.
they adapted. Adaptation doesn't complain, it just reshapes the body. And reshaped bodies pass lessons forward without language. That's how centuries speak quietly. Now here's the soft shift Part 31 is making. You don't need to earn this moment. Not through attention, not through understanding, not through effort. You're allowed to be here without contributing anything back. History isn't keeping score. It already took what it needed. Now let's sit with something even quieter. True rest often feels boring. Not peaceful, not profound, just flat. And flatness feels wrong to mind.